everyone today? Good, good. Thank you for that. Sorry I'm late. As you can tell, I was doing something else a couple of minutes ago. There's a Russian proverb that every day is a messenger of God. If a messenger from God, doesn't that encourage us to make sure that we openly and warmly greet that message every single day? The idea of not killing the messenger becomes even more important to remember, doesn't it, if we're talking about the day. Hospitality is a critical theme in our faith tradition. So how can we be most hospitable to that messenger? I've told you, actually I've told everyone who'll listen to me, that my favorite liturgy here is the Celtic liturgy. Part of that may be because it's in that chapel, which I find absolutely astounding. And I think part of the reason I find it absolutely astounding is the fact that we're not separated from the outside. We see the outside. And it really speaks to the Celtic belief that sacred and secular aren't separate. So there is no sacred and secular, it's just all sacred. It doesn't allow us to compartmentalize what we do in here and what we do out there. What we think in here, what we think out there. What we say in here, what we say out there. As we live, as we act, as we engage, and what we believe, we do that because of that belief. Celtic spirituality expresses hospitality this way: hospitality of heart. Welcoming God into our hearts each day, but also welcoming others because that person could be Christ. Remember, Hebrews 13 speaks of entertaining angels unaware. This must be seen in all-embracing welcome of people as people, not seeing labels or sex or race or denominations. We are committed to the love of God, to the love of neighbor, and to the love of one another. That must be our spiritual practice. Bryan in Finding Our Way Again says, spiritual practices are about life, about training ourselves to become the kinds of people who have eyes and actually see, and who have ears and actually hear, and so experience not just survival, but life. And that means for all of us. Spiritual practices are ways of becoming awake and staying awake to God. Staying awake. What we think of as sacred, if we haven't bought into all is sacred, even though that's my belief, sacred and secular must collide. And our spiritual practice must become our life's work.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I have the very distinct pleasure of introducing two of my very favorite people. Catherine Meeks, Dr. Catherine Meeks, is a professor, and she is also the chair of the beloved community for Dismantling Racism. So I had this whole spiel to say about her, and she says, don't talk much about me, because this is about our work. And for time's sake, I'm going to honor that. Also, we have the Reverend Deacon Timothy Summers Simmons, who is the chaplain at our lower school and currently serves at St. Paul's Episcopal Church as a deacon in Southwest Atlanta. Also a member of the beloved community for Dismantling Racism, and was selected as one of the young adults to attend a conference in Ferguson. So I'm going to turn the mic over to the two of them.
Hey everybody. We're going to sit here and pass the mic. For the sake of making sure that we have Q&A for a little bit, can someone set their alarm on their iPhone to 10:50? Is that time? And you have permission to just jump up. So, Catherine and I are both part of the beloved community for dismantling racism in the Diocese of Atlanta. There are usually kind of ground rules that all good racial reconciliation does for a conversation. So I thought it would be, before I let Catherine kind of explain what we do, I just want to put out those principles for a good conversation. So one is just always listen before you speak, is a big one. It's evident, but listening is a sacred practice, as we like to remind ourselves. And also speak using I statements. So make sure you're thinking and speaking for yourself instead of other people in the room or the community. This is a big one and an awkward one. And this is the principle of leaning into discomfort. So racism is evil and should make you uncomfortable. And talking about it is naturally uncomfortable. And the only way to really confront it is to not run from that discomfort, but lean into it. I do this on a daily basis, and it still makes me uncomfortable. So look at that comfort as like a holy blessing that you're moving in the right direction. Expect grace, because we're all going to need it at some point. Expect change, because when you feel that change is awkward and uncomfortable, but it's the work of the Holy Spirit. And so keep reminding yourself that that is a spiritual way of growing. This is a big one for white folks in the room. While guilt is often a natural response, whether that's social guilt or personal guilt, I'm reminded of what a friend of mine who's doing the same thing right now in Kentucky told me. And she's a person of color. She said, this is a quote she said to me yesterday. She just said, "I wish people would stop telling me about their guilt and move beyond it. It's not helping to change things, and they don't realize it, but it always ends up being about them." So I'm sure I always get guilty feelings when I think about racism, but then I've learned to think of, okay, how do I get beyond that and not make this a Timothy show? And I think the last one is, though we are many, we're one body. We're Christ's body, and the real reason why we're here is so we can live into that body. The gospel, or the passage from the epistle today about the hand needing the ear and the eye needing the leg. We're all Christ's body. We all have to be that body. And so exercising the demon of racism, as Bishop Curry has said this last week, confronting demons is awkward, it's uncomfortable, but it is totally necessary, particularly in a country where racism is the original sin. And I always like to remind myself, this is part of our baptismal covenant to respect the dignity of every human being. And the way I like to frame it positively is, we're doing healing work. And healing work, as any doctor knows, is not a painless process, but it's a necessary one, and it's really satisfying because healing bodies is awesome. So the Dismantling Racism Commission, the beloved community, is part of that healing process, and I'll let Catherine kind of explain what we try to do with the diocese.
Thank you, Timothy. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's so great to see people standing in a room on Sunday morning in Atlanta to talk about race. My goodness. We should send out a news flash or something, because people don't, that doesn't happen all the time. I'm so glad that you all are doing this work here at Holy Innocents. We're doing some wonderful things in the Diocese of Atlanta. We are working on dismantling racism in our culture, and we're making teeny steps toward doing some of that. And I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to chair the commission and for the opportunity to watch this process unfold in our diocese. The commission is called Beloved Community Commission for Dismantling Racism because in a very neat way, we are trying to create, it says what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a beloved community. And in order to do that, we have to dismantle racism. So our name pretty much embodies the vision that we have. And we changed the name. You might remember that this commission used to be called the Anti-Racism Commission. And people disliked that immensely. And we thought they disliked it because they just didn't want to think about racism. But then as we put our minds to it and stopped being a little defensive over it and decided to be creative and let the Holy Spirit speak to us, we came up with a better name. Beloved Community Commission for Dismantling Racism. We start all of our dismantling racism trainings with celebration of Holy Communion. And we do that as a reminder to ourselves that we are God's body. And we are a body that's got an illness called racism, and we have to work on that. And it's about our spiritual formation. It is not about coming to a meeting or a class or coming to a dismantling racism workshop. It is about the spiritual journey from birth until death, when being on that journey. So this event here today is just a little piece of the journey, and you need to think about it that way. When people come to training, we say to them, this day is just a little piece in your overall process of living in this world. This is something that goes on. It's, you know, we're not going to get it done today. We're not going to get it done next week, and we're probably not going to get it done in our lifetime. But we're going to work at it as if we think we're going to get it done. And that's the challenge, to keep being faithful, to keep being committed. And it's a challenge to do it with grace, with the acceptance of grace, and to do it with compassion, and to do it and not let yourself become embittered or jaded or cynical or any of those things that can happen when you're trying to deconstruct and dismantle some great big social issue that looks like it's never intended to change. Because if we work at trying to create this kind of liberation and end up not being liberated ourselves, then we haven't done much. Remember that passage of scripture that talks about what good does it do to try to help save the world, but you don't save yourself? So we don't need people to go out into the world to make the world better and forget to let their own hearts get made better. So the inner journey toward liberation is just a piece of the outer work that has to be done. It is both. You do not get to go, you know, do good somewhere about race and think you've done it. It's an inner journey as well as an outer journey. I think we missed out on getting that clear. I think that's part of why we see ourselves in the 21st century still having to struggle so hard with some of this. I think we went on the outer journey pretty well in the civil rights struggle. And we made some progress. And we need to claim that progress, because it's important to claim the progress we've made so that we don't just fall into despair. But we cannot sit down on that progress. We have to look at where we are, where we've come from, have to look at where we need to go, and we have to be faithful about staying on the path to get there. Now, Timothy's going to talk a little bit about why he, as a young white man, is willing to spend his Saturdays every other month hanging out with 15 folks talking about race, and then all of the other tasks that get sent his way by this woman who's always saying, but don't you have just a little more time?
She's referring to herself. If you didn't get that. So any good conversation about race, it's going to be informed by the larger history of things, but at some point you have to make it personal. And one thing that we, during this conversation, I'm going to be trying to model kind of what that personal reflection looks like. So, you know, how did a young white man get to spend his every Saturday a month, one Saturday each month, doing what I do? You know, I grew up in an environment that was almost, you know, 90% white, probably, without a lot of, no one talked about race, unless I saw it on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I'm not joking. The only way I knew how to talk about it was from sitcoms, mainly, or, you know, In Living Color, something like that. But, and so I was really ill-equipped to understand what was going on, or even know it was a big priority for me. I didn't see how it was influencing my community, how it had shaped my community. And I grew up outside of Detroit, which is a very segregated area in terms of living space, because my parents' families had moved out of Detroit after the riots. And so you have a white perimeter and chocolate middle. So that's kind of the area that I grew up in, and I didn't really think about race all that often. When I did start to think about it was post 9/11, really, because Michigan's also the highest concentration of Muslim Americans and Arab Americans in the world, outside of the Middle East. So although it wasn't black and white tension that just almost overnight exploded, but it was, the color of your skin mattered a lot right after that, particularly if you're of Arab descent. And so a lot of wrestling went on internally with me with how to respond to a whole slew of racist comments that I would hear, words that I didn't even know what they meant until, you know, you go home and this is the beginning of the internet, and then Google them, or in those days Yahoo them and Netflix them, or Netscape. But it quickly became apparent that there was this shadow that I had grown up with and was not aware of how racism worked in that community. Why were there very few people of color in my community? And what could I do to understand what was going on around me and try to solve the problem a little bit? I went to college the following year, and started to get in touch and make friends with people who looked different than I did. I joined the gospel choir. One of my roommates was African American. And so really just exposure and listening and trying to understand, you know, what are the differences that you and I face every day? What are the similarities? How can we celebrate? How can I support you? And that going along with a lot of reading about history. You know, my school system did not do a great job about teaching me the history of not just slavery, but Jim Crow and racism in American history. And so a big change in my mind happened when I stopped thinking about sin as only an individual problem. And I grew up in an evangelical background, and I'm not saying that all evangelicals think this way, but there's the further away you get from Catholicism, the more intensified emphasis you get on the individual is. And so as I started to move away from individualized thinking, closer to what I would say Catholic or Episcopal thinking, where sin becomes a social problem instead of just an individual one, that's when everything kind of clicked in my head, and it was like, I'm living in something that's much greater than I am. For me, it was, you know, there's this racial injustice, this gender injustice, this international injustice. This was during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so all of it kind of fermented at one point in time, and I decided I'm going to go out of my way to learn as much as I can about the history of racism, about the history of racism in my communities in Detroit, and I was living in Chicago at the time. And then seeing how that history still lives on in the present. And seeing that history in the present, it was real. After college, I went and taught in the inner city in Chicago, and basically, you know, it was like flipping it around, so there were maybe 10% people who were white and 90% people of color, and really getting that experience of what is this different world that I was never exposed to like. And so a lot of listening and a lot of learning went on. And that's how I have now come to be part of the beloved community, because I've made it a priority as someone who is, certain privileges are given to me because I'm a white heterosexual male. And that's just a fact. And so I can use those privileges to bring the conversation to spaces and to people who otherwise may not want to have them. So that's kind of how I got here. How did you get here, Catherine?
So next month I'm going to be 70, and I have been doing this work since I was a kid in college. So for the last 40-something years I've been devoted to this work. And part of the reason for that devotion has come from, I grew up hearing this story. My father told this story all the time about my brother who took ill, and my father, being, you know, good country folks always think you can give somebody a laxative and that cures everything. So they gave him a laxative, and his stomach didn't get better, and so he kept on complaining, and they finally had to take him to the hospital. They took him to the local hospital, not very far from where we lived, and they refused to see him because he was black and because they were poor. And they said, you have to go to the charity hospital, which was 75 miles away in Shreveport, Louisiana. And by the time they got there with my brother, he had gotten too sick to be helped. He had appendicitis and he died. He was 12 years old. My father never recovered from that death. My father was angry and sad and overprotective and mean and a lot of things because he couldn't protect us, and he knew he couldn't, and it made him crazy. And it made me know that I didn't want to live like that. I wanted to find a way to be an independent person. I did not want to have to be dependent upon a world that wasn't going to take care of me. And so I set about to become a person, to find a core place in myself that could be protected from the realities of the world that I was, the external world that I was living in. And my faith, I used to get up when I was a little girl, as 8 years old, and go sit out on the back steps and pray and watch the sun rise, which is a call, like little Samuel, you know, being nudged by God to get up. And so I see that as God's way of helping me to find a way to get through the world with a better, different understanding about life, and to learn how to be this kind of independent person that looks at the world in a way so that I did not have to be at the mercy of those kinds of forces that would be willing to let a 12-year-old boy die because of some structures that had been put into place. I did not want to be a person who just lived out of anger or fear or oppression. So I've dedicated myself to my own inner liberating processes, and in the process of doing that, I feel deeply called to try to share what I've learned from that journey with others who are interested, because I believe that we're all one. I believe there's one God. I don't care who we call that being or what or how we look at God. There is one God, and that God is the author of all life. And we're all connected. And so it's not good enough for me to sit somewhere and have projections onto white folks or Muslims or Native Americans or Latinos because I'm just talking about myself. I'm connected to all of those people, and I have to figure out how to make sense out of life within that context. And so It was never a choice for me. I wasn't going to hate white people. I was going to figure out how to love myself enough so that there would be no room inside of my heart to hate anybody. And that's been a long journey, a lot of psychotherapy, a lot of prayer, and a lot of work, and a lot of things, and a lot of discomfort, and choosing to live oftentimes in a marginalized way, because there are black people who don't think that this is the best way to get through life. There are black people who believe that you need to protect yourself from white people by keeping them outside of your heart. And I think the only place that we can find refuge is in each other's hearts. And we have to work at the external structures that make that process hard, because it is the process. It is how healing comes. It is what salvation is about. It's not some lofty thing out there somewhere that's going to happen someday. It is about living in the world with people and letting people in your heart and letting yourself be enclosed in other people's hearts. And so that's why I spend, now I'm a retired professor, and I spend 95% of my time doing this work. I'm supposed to be volunteer, but it's turned into a whole lot more than that. And I'm very, very thrilled about the way the work has progressed. We are going to be taking folks this October 22nd. Please mark your calendars and plan to join us on a pilgrimage. We're starting a set of pilgrimages to lynching sites this fall. And we're going to go to Macon, where 5 people were lynched, and we are going to have a memorial service, and we're going to tell those people what we think about them, and we're going to remember them, and we're going to put their names on a marker, and we're going to leave that marker there, and we're going to do this we're going to go to Macon this year, we're going to go toward Athens next year, and we're going to go into Forsyth County the 3rd year. There were 531 people lynched in Georgia. We're not able to go to every site and place markers at every site, but we're going to do our part. And the Equal Justice Initiative, which was founded by Bryan Stephenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy that some of you are reading. And by the way, Bryan Stephenson will be here speaking on September 29th, so that's another event that you want to make sure you put on your calendars, because you don't want to miss hearing him. He is absolutely fabulous. He is an anti-death penalty lawyer who has gotten over 100 people off death row who were innocent. He spent a lot of time getting children who had been given life sentences. We're one of the few countries in the world that's willing to sentence children to life imprisonment, which says something about us that we ought to really reflect upon. So our pilgrimages are designed to pay attention to the intersection between slavery, lynching, mass incarceration, and the death penalty, because the death penalty is just another rendition of lynching. And you maybe don't know this, but when people are killed in Georgia, they stretch them out on the cross, stretch them out on the gurney like Jesus was stretched out on the cross. I find that interesting. I don't know why, because when you go to the hospital and they give you an IV, they don't put your arms out like you're on the cross. Your arms are laying beside you. And I don't know why we have to kill people that way, because I don't know why they have to be stretched out. But anyway, that's a subject for another day. But we want to invite you to join us in these pilgrimages, and we want to invite you to hear Bryan Stephenson, invite you to read Just Mercy. There's also some of us are reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, which looks at the kind of religious connections between lynching and the cross. And all of this stuff is related, and it's very important to try to understand some of those intersections. We have also the Equal Justice Initiative has done an abstract of their research on lynching across the country. And it's a very good piece of work that they've done. So we have to look these old horrors in the face and destabilize them, deconstruct them, and reduce the energy that's associated with them so that we can build new structures and have them be real structures. I'm really interested in racial healing. I have no interest in racial reconciliation. Racial healing for me requires us to pay attention to the past, just as any kind of healing requires us to pay attention to the past, to figure out some way to acknowledge that past. That's the alarm for that you asked to have set. We have to acknowledge that those injuries, and we have to do whatever it takes to build a new foundation so real healing can occur. Racial reconciliation is talked about a lot. What we want to do is we want to jump over that hard stuff and just kind of get together and act like everything's all right. And when we do that, after a while we get tired of acting. And then we go back to where we really were. When we do the real work of healing, we don't have to get tired because we've dealt with the stuff. So we don't have to keep going back to it. So that's why I'm interested in racial healing. And I think racial healing is what Jesus is interested in. So now, why don't we stop right here and let you, whoever, there's so many folks, and so I know some folks won't get to say what you want to say, but ask questions, make comments, or whatever until, what time's the next service?
11:15.
Okay.
Don't worry, I'm only the deacon.
Okay, but there are people here who need to go.
Probably about 11 o'clock, maybe 11:05.
Okay, all right, yes ma'am. And speak loudly.
My name is Pat Connor. It's spelled C-O-N-N-E-R. I'm not related to Bull Connor, thank you God. And I'm an ardent civil rights supporter, and I think it's because my father and family were transferred from Arlington, Virginia to Birmingham, Alabama, when Bull Connor was the police commissioner. And those were terrible times. Terrible, terrible, terrible times. I will never forget it. I'll never forget about the little girls who were murdered. I mean, I can think about it today and get teary-eyed all over again. But I love being a civil rights supporter because it has allowed me to meet so many amazing people who are not white. And I've just appreciated it. It has enriched my life so, so very much. When we first were transferred from Arlington, Virginia, where the schools had been integrated, all of the black students were surrounded by a clot of cops, the Secret Service. That just appalled me that that was necessary. But we moved to Birmingham. It's a totally, totally different city. My father had to call on all of the elected officials, and he had to call on Police Commissioner Bull Connor. And Bull said, how do you spell your name? Dad said, we spell it C-O-N-N-E-R. And Bull said, you must be part of the bastard Irish. So years passed, and Bull Connor announced that he was going to retire. And the chamber asked Dad to introduce him. So Dad related that story of meeting Bull Connor and said, now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll let you determine which one of us is the bastard, because Bull Connor had destroyed opportunities for Birmingham.
Goodness, how courageous of your father.
We had a sleepless night that night.
Can I make a comment?
So one of the things I think is important to remember about trying to dismantle racism is, especially for white folks, at least like me, like it wasn't as though it wasn't as though my parents were like against civil rights, or the community that I was in was against civil rights. It's hard to meet. It's not hard, but rarely do I meet an American who's like, I'm against civil rights. But for me, the work of dismantling racism, even being aware of what external things need to take place, we have to look internally and try to shift our perspective from going from one that is rooted in racism, or at least colored by its scars. And the scars of racism are all across the country, and they will always be across the country. You can't tell American history without talking about slavery. You can't even go back in your own family histories without talking about slavery. And so I really encourage everybody to at least consider my story, in that my dismantling racism is an internal project as well as an external one. And it's one that I have to go through every single day to try to make myself more aware of where those scars have not healed, what I can do to try to be more aware of them. We all have implicit bias. This is actually something that a lot of diversity and racial justice people are learning from a lot of people in the business world. You know, a very obvious thing in business is that you want to meet the needs and demands of the most amount of people possible. And so having a diversity of voices going on in your head and perspectives for a board is really helpful, because you can meet more of your consumer base. And so a lot of these boardrooms are doing a lot of scientific funding to say, how can we be better listeners? And how can we have a bigger perspective on other people's needs and demands so that we can meet those? And I think it's really important for me always to say, are the voices that I'm letting in, are those representative of everybody in the community? And so part of dismantling racism for me is not just kind of like voting and standing behind very obvious civil rights, but asking myself, what are the biases and the blinders that I have on that I don't recognize? You know, whether it's with race or with gender. You know, if you're a one man sitting in a room full of women, you'll get a really different opinion about things. I'm a lower school chaplain, so I'm like one of, well, 4 men who work with 30 women. So, but the same applies to race, is that you get a different experience of things when you listen to different voices. And so part of that dismantling racism is allowing those voices to form you and to let them into your heart and shape your sense of responsibility and opinions. And coming up with, the term is implicit bias. It's the things that we're biased about that we're not aware of. And the other big thing was like recognizing that I have privileges that are afforded me because I'm white. You know, the term is white privilege. It is a lightning rod, because a lot of people, my first reaction was, that doesn't exist. You know, I come from a working class family, I'm not that privileged, but there are certain realities, and you know, the data speaks for itself. This is math at a certain point. But white privilege is just acknowledging that I'm given certain benefits to being white that people of color don't have to face. Whether it's 30% of people, or 30, if I'm tried for a crime and a person of color is tried for a crime, a person of color is 30% more likelihood of being found guilty for it. And these are just numbers that, you know, Harvard and the other major universities, they do the number crunching on these. But what I have kind of come to about kind of like saying, okay, I am given certain privileges for being white, just like I'm given certain privileges for being a man. Like, how can I use these privileges to the benefit of other people? For people of color, for people who have experienced a history of injustice, and how can I create the space where all people can be treated like God's children and thrive with equality? So kind of coming to that acknowledgement has allowed me to take part in larger systems, but a lot of it is so much internal and so many small conversations that I hope you have, you know, at the dinner table, at the workplace, even calling out saying, like, you know, I don't get why that joke is funny. It sounds kind of racist to me. Like, everyone hears a racist joke in here every once in a while. And it's those little small things that can sometimes be the harder one than saying, like, I'm against, like, people who are against civil rights, like, or I'm against Bull Connor. Like, that, yeah, back in the day it was harder. Today it's kind of like, you sound kind of racist. But it's the small calling out of racism. If you even think it or feel it or say, like, you know, this is a problem, I feel like that's so much of the internal work needs to be done. So,
yeah. Questions?
Questions.
And
Thank you. I'm Dorothy Beasley from the Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, so I'm an imposter here in a way, or at least interloper. And first I want to apologize to all the people who are standing. I came early, so I have a seat. Shouldn't the people of this church should be sitting where I'm sitting, but we're almost over, so I'll stay here. Desmond Tutu wrote a book, No Future Without Forgiveness. And I wondered, and of course he was head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you said reconciliation is not where we should be headed. Do you think forgiveness is too close to the reconciliation way of dealing with things?
Well, I think forgiveness is an important dynamic that has to occur inside of all of us. We have to forgive ourselves. As a black person, I have to forgive myself for internalizing oppression. I have to forgive white people for promoting oppression. So those kinds of, you have to work that out somehow for yourself, you know? And when Bishop Tutu talks about reconciliation, you notice that in the front of it is truth and reconciliation. Yes. So racial healing for me embodies the possibility of, look, you have to uncover the truth in order for reconciliation to be possible. And what we have done in America, we love to have these pulpit swaps and stuff. You know, on Sunday some black priest goes to a white church and vice versa, or people exchange choirs and do all these little kind of cosmetic things, and we feel good about it. And February is coming, and we can all be into black history and listen to some black speeches, and we will go and hear the Dr. King speech again, the I Have a Dream speech, and then we're all happy for a year. That's what I'm talking about, that I don't have any patience with. You know, because those are superficial kinds of actions that simply make us delude ourselves into thinking we've done something, when it's important to be thinking about what are we thinking when we're driving down the freeway and don't want to come downtown Atlanta. You know, what's that about? I hear people on the north side of Atlanta being afraid to come downtown Atlanta. I go downtown Atlanta all the time. There's nothing going on in downtown Atlanta that's not going on anywhere else in the country. Human beings running around doing stuff. Yeah, there's some homeless people down there, but they don't bother anybody. But how many times have I heard people say to me, you know, I know I'm not coming to the cathedral. You know, really? I mean, it's not on Mars. It's on Peachtree Street. You know, and so that's it's, you know. And if you're you know, if you are walking somewhere and you see somebody that looks different and you have some visceral reaction to them, you need to pay attention to that. You know, so it's that kind of stuff that gets at the core, the kind of thing that Timothy is talking about, is that what Bell Hooks calls self-interrogation. We have to interrogate ourselves about why, you know, why am I telling this story about that event? And when somebody black tells you their story, are you able to take it in, listen to it, and let it be their story, or do you feel the need to edit it and fix it and clean it up and help them to understand why it's not how they thought it was? Because whatever they said it was, that's what it is. It's their experience. And what we need is for people not to edit our experience. Everybody needs that. If you got bit by a dog and you tell me how it feels, you don't need me to explain to you what a dog bite is. Because you were the one who got bitten. You know? Somebody's saying, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was thinking about how many friends of mine have said, oh, I'm not a racist. If you grow up in the South and you're white, you're a racist. Because I look at my own family, from my grandparents, my parents, me, my children, grandchildren. We've made movement. But it's like you said, 40 years you've been at this. Right. And you know, the reason I know I'm a racist, if I'm walking down a dark street and a black man crosses over to where I am, it scares me more than if it's a white man. That's racism. Yeah. Because I don't know either of these people. One is no more dangerous than the other.
Right. And being on a dark street at night is an issue, regardless of who's walking.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Christy Wooten, and I'm a writer and consultant. I've spent the last couple of years working with the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. I know most of you have heard of it. It's a museum downtown. And I think we've also read in the newspaper it's been struggling and things like that. And I think part of that is that people might consider it, you know, it's a museum, it's going to be fun, it's going to be what we do between the aquarium and the world of Poe. But back to what you were talking about, scars and guilt and healing and things being a small piece of a healing process. I would just encourage anybody who's interested in maybe finding another part of that healing process to go and visit, white, black, whatever. It's a very emotional experience for everyone, and it's not necessarily going to leave you feeling horrible, but it is going to be some realization and some recognition. As a white blonde girl from the South, I mean, just working on that all along, it was like, whoa. Because I didn't live through a lot of it because I wasn't born yet. So I think all generations, I mean, I would welcome everybody to come and see the center. It's $15, 2 hours. It could be a small part of the beginning on your journey of healing.
Tandy, can you organize a field trip for us?
The school has a partnership with the museum.
Yeah. And I can help facilitate that if you need.
Follow me up on that. Another question?
Yeah, and just real quick, because I think we're running out of time, but can you comment on celebrating the diversity? As like healing sounds sort of, you were talking about internal and in the community, and we get to a point where we figured out something, but what about the kind of proactive and positive spin to it? So, because to me, sometimes I feel just because somebody says, let's say Arab or Muslim, you know, you're automatically racist because you're calling out somebody as different. And on the other spectrum of that, there's, okay, we are different, and why not celebrate the differences and figure out how we make something better out of it, rather than just kind of running away from the fact that we are different.
Yeah, I think this is a big one. And I was reminded this weekend, so I was brought up in the environment where being colorblind was like, that was the goal. And what I've come to learn in, you know, this took me a while to kind of wrap my mind around, because, you know, resistance is the first reflex. But colorblind is the idea that you want to just, everyone is equal, and so you don't see color, or you don't see differences. But the shift now within educating people, particularly children, my thing is you want to bring out those differences as much as you can. You want to celebrate them, and for me, it's a face-to-face thing. This isn't done, you know, on the internet. You can. That's how you organize it, and that's how you can learn about it. But you got to like do some face-to-face work with other people to really go out of your way. You know, hold their hands, pray with them. These are like share communion with them. These are like really basic, you know, Christian rituals that. Definitely celebrating diversity and recognizing, you know, what you have in common within that diversity is really key. And I think if you refuse to do this is what I learned from Ferguson. If you refuse to sit down with your neighbors, and if you refuse to try to hear and understand what their grievances and what their pain is, you are setting yourself up for a highly explosive environment. And you're going to be dealing with the causes of that destruction. I mean, compared to the riots in the 60s, Ferguson was small, but it's very, those conditions when people are not talking, are not praying together, are not sharing face-to-face conversation and meals, like, we have to do that. All people of color have to do that. And so, I just really encourage you to let that be your prayer, let it be a spiritual practice that you do. How can you celebrate differences, and how can you have these conversations, particularly with young people and with children and with teenagers, about what is this reality of racism, and how can we start to do things to change it and heal it.
And I know that we're out of time because there is church service that I haven't been to church yet. I don't know about, I mean, to the other part of church. This is also church. But thank you all so much for your attention.
Thank everyone for coming. Next week we'll see part 2 of the Jonathan Museum with Pilgrimage and have more conversation.